So when the movie came out, the film studio was completely like, where did all these people come from? How did they? Because they weren't actually advertising it. You know, we were, had T-shirts and posters, and they had, a few things. But that was the reason, because everybody said, "Oh, you were so smart." It was like such a good idea. Well, I had already, when I wrote Star Wars, it was too long. It wasn't 500 pages, it was like 210 or something. But I said, well, I can't make this into a movie. This is way too big. I need about 100 pages. And that's when I rewrote, I wrote the first act, basically. And that's why I demanded that I wanted the sequel rights. Because if they were going to sit on it, I've already been through this before, where they would sit on something and say, well, we don't want to do it, we're not going to sell it to you, but if we do, we'll sell it to another studio for an ungodly amount of money. And of course, they won't buy it because I could barely sell it as I was. So I said, I want the sequel rights. And of course, the first rule that you learn in film school or anywhere else, don't ever invest in movies. You will lose your money. The fact that people make money in the movie business is a myth. It doesn't happen, especially in Hollywood. It's just like, somebody says, well, look at, I can tell you 10% of the net of so-and-so in this movie, and it stars Tom Cruise, but you'll never see a dime. So, and I knew that, but I did want to get the rights because I didn't want them to sit on it. And not let me, because I would say, well, I'll make 3 movies out of this now, because there's too much material there for me to do. And that's what started that whole Star Wars craziness. And so.
That's interesting. It was the deal of the century, what you've done with Star Wars. But do you realize that now it's impossible to get these kind of stories? I mean, not a studio will put money on such a big movie if it's not an IP or if it's not a comic book, if it's not something that people know. And for a young kid arriving in the business and saying, getting what you got, it's impossible. So what could the George Lucas of today do to make the Star Wars of today?
Well, it was impossible to do it then, really. I mean, to ask, the only way I managed to get a lot of the deal, which again, there was no money in licensing. And the studio didn't have a licensing department. It was just like, oh, well, we don't do that. Maybe Planet of the Apes because it's a TV series, and so we can do that. But there was no money in it. It was just like, oh, well, it's kind of, we do it. But that's the thing that is like, it didn't mean anything to them. And the sequel rights, their attitude was, we don't like this movie, it's really terrible, and it's stupid. So what do we care about the sequel rights? Because the studio's going to get sold anyway. So we won't take the blame for any of this, and even that, it won't go anywhere. They had no faith in it whatsoever. And as I say, even when the board of directors saw it, they said, this is terrible, let's sell it. And so part of it was I had a script and a thing that nobody wanted, and I had a couple of people who were my champions, which was Laddie and Ashley Boone and people. It's like, so they didn't care. They just said, well, this isn't worth anything. There is no licensing, not in a movie. He'll never get that license for anything, except maybe T-shirts and posters, which, with that, he'll make maybe $20,000. So that's the deal. But I knew when I did, I said, even with American Graffiti, I said, there was another one of those in American Graffiti, which is when we started to finish the movie, we went to Universal and we said, and we were buying the rights to all, there's 70 songs in that movie, pop songs. And they said, we said, for another $3,000 a song, we can get the album rights to all the songs in the movie. They said, we don't want those, we don't want those, we don't want those. So when the movie came out, it was a giant, huge hit. They went out and spent like $2 or $3 million just to get the rights for the album. and then they did 2 albums. It's like, that was Hollywood then. I don't really know. I've been retired for 10 years. I'm not sure what it's like now. But, you know, they weren't they didn't really understand the business the way somebody who's on the ground does. And the people on the ground, director, writer, you know, if you say, I'm going to make this movie no matter what, and people have done it, you can actually do it. And now there are a lot more with streaming. It's very easy. It was easy. Now it's not. They shut it down. But it was that they were throwing money around like crazy. And so if you had a crazy movie and you could say, well, I can make this into 4 movies, you know, you can pretty much get a deal. But now they're, you know, backed off. So it's not quite as easy as it was. But the secret to the whole thing, ultimately, is persistence, which is in the movie. It's the only, and you know, I battled it for 2 or 3 years, 4 years for each movie. And I just kept pushing, and not giving up because I was passionate about the film. And I didn't really care about the deal. I just cared about getting to make the movie. It was from film school. All we did was, our passion was to make the movie. We didn't care. And we were hoping that somebody wouldn't figure out the secret, which is for film students and young people. You'll pay to make the movie. I'll pay you all I've got, you know, $300. And, you know, or I'll do it for free, which is also a thing like with Jim Cameron, who I became friends with, who, you know, when he did Titanic, it went over. You know, he had 50% on that, but it was going over budget, way and over time, and he finally said, look, I'll do this film, but I will give up my percentage. Which, they can't, if you're still going to give them something, they can't resist it. He said, I'll give you all my percentage. And he did the same thing on the next film that he did. And he said, you're crazy. What are you doing? This is nuts. He said, but I want to make my movie. I want to make my movie. I said, you know, it's not going to make any difference to them. I mean, yes, they're not going to shut it down. I said, you know, there's a secret to making movies. If you're halfway through and you spend a ton of money, and they did the Star Wars, they cut me off because they said, it was, you know, Fox was going out of business. I said, you've got to finish in 3 weeks. I mean, I was 1 week over. And they said, well, you can't go over anymore. I said, but I still have the whole opening of the film. When Darth Vader arrives with Princess Leia, it sets up the plot. This is all, you have to have this. You can't start without that. And they said, well, you know, that's, you gotta stop. And so I said, you know, I can get that shot, but I'm gonna have to work 24 hours a day with 3 new crews, and it's gonna cost you a lot more than if you just let me go the 3 weeks instead of cutting it up in 1 week. And so I said, you know, they said, look, just stop when we say it, because what they wanted to do is the announcement in the trades. They said Star Wars is finished, and they finished shooting. That's an important thing for them. It doesn't mean anything because I did get all these crews, and it did cost them. You know, Star Wars, the budget, the original budget, which was, you know, what it actually costs, just like building a building. You say, well, this is the lumber, these are the people, they're going to work this many weeks, and this is how much they get paid, and you come up with a real budget. They're not used to that. They're used to producers just scamming them and putting a number out there. And I said, this isn't like that. This is a real cost. And as a result, what happened is, when I gave them the budget of $13 million, they said it's got to be under 10. And I said, I can't do it for under 10. I said, you know, I'm not going to cut stuff out of the script. And he said, well, look, just make the movie. That was Laddie. He said, we'll figure that out. So it came out, and it was 13 million. And so they were really excited about the fact that it was, you know, 10 days over or 2 weeks over from what they accepted, which, you know, it was just, they didn't understand that that isn't a way you save money by just cutting it off. You don't get a movie, you don't, you know, it's just, that world, I'm not sure if it still exists, but it kind of still exists, meaning it's impossible, and you just have to have the passion and the persistence to continue to do what you need to do to get the movie made the way you want it. Now, I'm famous for being a bit of I want things to be perfect. I don't want to have a movie out there that's half-assed. And so that is why, I don't know if this is a question yet, but that is why I went back after Star Wars. Or it was even after that, it was after the 3 Star Wars, and I was experimenting with digital technology and trying to build a digital pipeline so we could make digital movies. And so the movies, I said, there are things that were never finished. They were just movies get abandoned. They don't get finished unless you're Stanley Kubrick or somebody. Otherwise, they just say stop and that's it. And so I had a lot of stuff in there that didn't get finished, that I wanted to finish. And then when we developed digital technology, I said, well, we can go back and fix a lot of these things. You know, the things were like stupid things that only a filmmaker cares about, which is in a lot of the movies, especially in Empire Strikes Back, because it was white on white, the map lines around the characters was very extreme. I thought it was extreme. I'm sure the movie came out, nobody cared, but I cared. I didn't want to have that, but it was a lot of things like that. And I had shot a scene that we were gonna, with Jabba the Hutt, that we ran out of time, we ran out of money, and we didn't have the technology to actually do it because it was we were working on the design of a big slug. And so, and I just shot it with a stand in there to do it. And I said, I want that scene back because now Jabba the Hutt's going to be, because he's in the other movies. And this is a good way to set it up. I should have, that's why I put it in there in the first place. But it was one of those things where I said, cut. You know, anything that's expensive. And that was one we didn't really have an answer about how we were going to do it. So,
about that, and come back about making of Star Wars in a minute, I have a question to fans on the web, and Nicola Michalski is asking, many of them revere the VHS of Laserdisc of the original version of the first Star Wars. Are you going to release one day a Blu-ray or 4K version of the original one? Or?
Well, we did release the original one on a Laserdisc. And everybody got really mad. They said, well, it looks terrible. I said, I know it did. One of the big things when we redid the movies is that the color and the movies had faded. They were terrible. They were scratched up. There were no real copies. We took the best copies we could from all over the world, which is the way you restore movies. They were still kind of bad. And so the big deal was to restore the actual, which is what we do with the Film Foundation. We take old movies and restore them so they look great. And that was really the impetus of it. And I said, well, since we're going to do that, I want to fix all the things that I didn't get to finish. And so I did that. That was the reasoning behind all that. Now, if they wanted to see it on the way it was, they looked at the Laserdisc. I mean, it was on one of VHSs that we released. And it looked terrible. And they said, well, this is terrible. You purposely made it terrible. You made it, I said, we didn't. That is what it looked like. And it cost, just to do the rehab of the movie, each movie was $6 million. I said, I'm trying to make movies, and I can't, that's a lot of money. And I wanted to fix them at the same time, which we were doing experiments with digital to see what we could actually do. And ILM was learning how to do digital technology. So there were a lot of reasons behind it, and I'm a firm believer that the director, or the writer, or the filmmaker should have a right to have his movie be the way he wants it. It goes all the way back, to, Michelangelo. He worked on a scaffolding. He did it. It took him 6 months to do a section. Then he finally came down. And they removed the scaffolding. And he looked at it. Nah, we're going to redo that. A whole ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. So I don't think I was that outrageous. But that's what, when you're working on something and you create it, you want it to be right. You don't want it to be not right. So
I'm going to tell you a little personal story, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people in this room have the same. I saw the first one, I was a kid, and when the music starts, when the I was like, I realized what I realized what cinema really can be. My question is pretty simple. What was your reaction when you listened to John Williams' music for the first time?
I loved it. Well, Steve, I was talking to Steve and I was saying,
Steven Spielberg.
Steve Spielberg. I got this, I said, well, what are you going to do about music and everything? I said, well, this is like, the movie is like it was made in the 30s. It's a Republic serial, from the script to the dialogue to the music to everything. And in those movies, they use classical music. But they just did it as a needle drop. And I said, I want to do it, but I want to do it more like Peter and the Wolf. I want each character to have their own theme song, and I want to then, it needs to be a full orchestra. Which in those days, you're going to do it with a synthesizer, right? You're going to do it, you're going to do rock and roll. I said, no, we're going to do a 1930s score, because it's a 1930s movie. And by that time, I managed to get that through. But Steven said, you want John Williams? I said, but he's kind of a jazz guy. No. He can do classical music. Nobody knows him as a classical composer, but he is. I said, okay. And, he'd play stuff on the piano, and I said, okay. But when I walked onto we did it at Abbey Road in England, and I hadn't heard it with a full orchestra. And when I heard it with a full orchestra, I went, oh my God, this is, it's just exactly what anybody would do when they hear those scores. Because I'm a firm believer, and I say this even from my first on THX, so I said, sound is half the movie. And it's the half that is the least expensive to do. So you get 50% of the results for maybe 25% of the cost. So, and people just say, well, no, the soundtrack would always get thrown to the end. The composer would say, well, do this, they didn't really spend a huge amount of time sorting it out. Where I always have, Walter Birch and I went to school together, and he was a sound guy, and he was an editor, and he made movies. He had a real sense of humor. He was a writer. Francis, when we moved to San Francisco, and we had the Rain people, he said, I got this great Steenbeck mixing machine that I got from Denmark. It's going to be shipped in here. because we had a little tiny place. And we'll be able to mix our own movies, and it'll be fantastic. And he said, do you know anybody who knows how to mix movies? I said, I got just the guy. And we sent him to Sausalito to live on a little houseboat, and he mixed the movies. And then he mixed my movies. He did America Graffiti, and you know, it's you know, that is why the films are as good as they are, is because there's been a huge attention to the soundtrack, and it's the soundtrack is important. It creates, it's the secret sauce that makes the poetic art come out.
This explains. At the time when Star Wars, you hope, but Star Wars at the time becomes a biggest success ever, how do you explain the phenomenon at the time, and how do you explain it now? Is it the same explanation?
It's basically, I think, the same thing, because when Star Wars came out, everybody was saying, oh, let's make spaceship movies, let's make spaceship movies. I said, Star Wars isn't a spaceship movie. There's a lot more to it, and the purpose of Star Wars was, it was during the Vietnam War. I was going to do Apocalypse Now. I couldn't do it, so I took a lot of the ideas and put it into this movie. And the thing was, Apocalypse Now for me was going to be like Dr. Strangelove. It was going to be a satire. It was going to be kind of funny. Some of that stuff is still in there. Francis did it very seriously, but it's, you know, surfing. People didn't know that those guys were surfing over there or doing drugs or anything. The only movie that did come out was Green Berets. And this was sort of the anti-Green Beret movie to say this is what was really going on. A lot of that stayed in there. John Milius is just one of the best writers ever, but he's very macho, let's say. And so I was going to use that as I was going to experiment, make it more extreme than it really was, but it was quite extreme. And Francis toned it down because he liked what is the movie? Book. There was Heart of Darkness. He loved Heart of Darkness, and so he said, "This is just like Heart of Darkness, you know." And you know, because they're going up a river, which we had in there. But he then said, "We'll do Heart of Darkness," and so he changed it that way and made it more serious and more weird. Because it was weird because a lot of it was satire. It was funny, but it didn't get sort of, it wasn't done like Dr. Strangelove. So anyway, that's where that
So the Star Wars phenomenon? And the Star Wars phenomenon? The explanation?
Well, Star Wars is for kids who are 12 years old. It's always been designed that way. And it's for kids during the Vietnam War, where all of us were about to be drafted and people were coming back in coffins, friends and things, and we were marching against, you know, the civil rights movement was going on. There were a lot of things that were very dark, and we said, I said, you know, I want to make something, because American Graffiti was so powerful for kids that I said, well, I want to make another kids movie for 12-year-olds that are going through puberty, that don't know what they're doing, why they're here, asking all the questions about what should I be worried about, what should I think about, what's important. And Star Wars has all those things in there. They're buried in there, but you definitely get it, especially if you're young. And of course, the people that loved the movie were all somewhere between 10 and 15 years old. And then, you know, so it was hard in the end because I wanted to do the prequels, but I knew that, you know, I was just going to do whatever I wanted. I wasn't going to make something that would be try to be a bigger hit than Star Wars. So I did 1, 2, and 3, and 1, which got completely trashed. Just when 1 came out, it was the beginning of the internet. It was the first film we did, because I'd spent 10 years developing digital technology in order to make 1, 2, 3. Because I knew that there would be a big battle with Yoda and things like that that I couldn't possibly do with a puppet. And so we had to come up with another way of creating all that stuff. And there were a lot of stuff, finally visual effects we could do that we couldn't do before. So we did it, and of course the critics and the fans who had been 10 years old when they saw the first one, and then there were 13 and then there were 16, hated it. Said, that's a children's film. I don't want to see a children's film. It's terrible. That Jar Jar is terrible. I said, everybody said the same thing about 3PO. That guy's so irritating. Why don't you get rid of him? There was a huge thing about getting rid of 3PO. And then when I did the third one, the Ewoks, they said, well, those are little teddy bears, those are little kids. This is a kids movie. We don't want to see a kids movie. We want to see an adult film. I said, it's a kids movie. It's always been a kids movie. It is a kids movie.